In the meantime here, I want to bring into the conversation our friend there at the Washington Examiner, Christian Daytok, who was just at that White House joint press conference between President Trump and Bibi Netanyahu. He joins me. Christian, good to see you here. And boy, this was quite newsy. We want to talk to you about a lot of stuff. Let's first focus on that. It seemed like there was maybe gasps in the room. I saw a lot of reporters' faces, and they looked quite stunned, to be honest, that, President Trump floated this idea of possibly having the United States, have some role in the rebuilding of the Gaza Strip completely. How did it go over in the room?
Well, I hope I wasn't one of those faces that seemed too surprised, Andrew, but it was quite shocking. And let's be straight, this wasn't just President Trump talking about the U.S. having a role in rebuilding Gaza. He's talking about a full-on takeover of that 140 square mile plot of land and what he called a long-term occupation. He went on to go and say that when they're done with Gaza, they're going to do, quote, a very good job. And people will look at it as the Riviera of the Middle East. Of course, there are concerns entering office with Trump that he would try and redevelop Gaza somehow and make a resort location where the Palestinian people used to live. Now, earlier in the day, Trump had been talking about how Arab nations do need to take in these Palestinian refugees. But so far, no Arab countries have come forward to accept President Trump's proposal.
Okay, so quite active outside the White House right now. That's a live picture outside where you are going. I just wanted to talk with you, since you're in the briefing a lot, you're in these news conferences, you're also sometimes traveling with the president. Can you offer just briefly kind of a juxtaposition with the Biden administration and the press access and the amount of times we see the president on kind of an hour-to-hour, day-by-day basis compared with Biden and Trump? There is a marked difference, is there not?
Without a doubt. Through these first 2.5 weeks or so, we've heard from Trump more than a dozen times speaking with reporters. Today alone, he took questions on 3 separate occasions, including that press conference with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I do think, of course, the Biden team's strategy was to keep the former president away from reporters. But we should have learned from President Trump's first term in office, that's just simply not how he operates. The press conference today was supposed to be a traditional 2x2 bilateral. That's where each leader calls on 2 reporters from the respective press corps. But again, we had upwards of 10, 12, 15 questions where President Trump was calling on both members of the U.S. press and the Israeli press. It does seem shocking after the last 4 years of the Biden administration, but it's really just par for the course when it comes to how Trump interacts not only with the media, but with his supporters when he's off on the campaign trail there last year, or when he might be, traveling across the country. He has talked about how he wants to visit more of the United States than he did during his first term in office, and potentially even travel abroad. He, when asked earlier today, said he wants to very soon visit both Israel and Gaza to check on the progress that the U.S. could potentially be making here very shortly.
Yeah, Christian, while we have you, because there's so much happening there at the White House, I just want to touch on a few things that a lot of our viewers are interested in, especially an update on the federal workforce buyout. They have until Thursday, they meaning, all 2 million federal employees, to resign, and then they can accept their pay until, September, but they will not ultimately go back to their jobs. According to Bloomberg, more than 20,000 employees, that's only about 1% of the federal workforce, have signed up for an offer to quit their jobs in exchange for a deferred resignation deal here. Now, from what I was hearing last week, the administration expects around 10% of the federal workforce to do this. Only around 20,000 have done this so far. What is going to happen with this idea out there for federal workers? Will they actually resign and get that back pay or not? We're seeing some back and forth here. There is some kind of discrepancies in the rollout of this, is there not?
There has been discrepancies in the rollout. There's also been some misreporting about who actually can sign up for the DRP. Like you mentioned, it's not actually going to be all 2 million federal employees. Any national security related agency, whether that's at DHS or at the Pentagon, they are not eligible. That's because the Trump administration, of course, in pursuing their deportation agenda, wants as many ICE and CBP officers as possible, and they don't have time to staff up. Also, when you talk about President Trump's forced posture regarding now a potentially new situation, a new deployment in the Middle East, he's talked about working with the Mexican government to conduct military operations against the cartels. They don't want to be starting over from scratch. Okay. But that 10% estimate that you threw out there, that is what the White House was expecting. And so far, just 2 days before that February 6th deadline, they're falling far short of that number. So it could mean that federal workers would be coming back to the workforce, working in person like President Trump has demanded, or it could mean that some of these career civil servants, based on what they're seeing happen at USAID or Treasury, they could outright resign their positions, and that would leave the Trump administration in a bind as they're trying to implement their policies.
Yeah, I mean, Christian, Fox Business obtained a memo today sent out from the Office of Personnel Management, which was sent out to department agencies to clarify questions that employees have on this. Notably, in the memo, it says the deferred resignation offer is legally binding on the government. And if the government were to say, renege on this offer, then the employees would be, quote, entitled to request a rescission of his or her resignation here. So that's really, really interesting. So this memo is leaving open the door for the U.S. government, to tell these federal workers, a federal worker, that, no, you got to stay in your job.
It is, and I think that just sort of adds to the confusion which with this has been rolled out. Of course, it was first leaked to the media. Then we got formal confirmation from the White House and from OPM. And if you look forward to where the federal workforce needs to be come the spring, when a potential government shutdown could be happening if Republicans in Congress can't get their act together and agree on a vehicle to advance those spending policies, this could be a major disaster in Trump's face. Because again, this DRP was put forth as sort of an olive branch because Donald Trump wants to shrink the federal bureaucracy, cut federal spending, but at the same time, he's trying to do it in a way where it won't leave all of these hundreds of thousands, if not millions of workers in a lurch without a job. That's certainly not going to be good for his approval rating. And that's one of the metrics that Donald Trump cares about the most.
Have you spoken to any federal workers? I'm just kind of curious. I mean, there's so many of them about how this is kind of going down, how this is being received.
I have spoken to some who plan on taking that offer. I have spoken to some workers who said they will be returning to the office. I think ultimately people are trying to wait until the very last minute because there is this sense of confusion around not only whether they will be essentially furloughed but paid out through the remainder of the program this coming fall, or if they still need to work remotely like they've been doing since 2020 and the COVID pandemic. I'm sure we'll have more information tomorrow, maybe even Thursday morning before this deadline actually hits. But that's just sort of the state of play here in Washington. Of course, it's one of the centers of the largest federal workforce across the country.
Yeah, you kind of have to feel a little sympathetic for those who are at the Office of Personnel Management right now. That's kind of like the federal government's HR department, because there have been so many stories about what is going on. The federal workforce buyout is completely separate from that memo that went out about this time last week, freezing federal funds. Federal judges have gotten involved. From what I understand, the federal judge's restraining orders on that very memo, freezing federal funds, is still in place, correct?
That is correct. But the White House went ahead and rescinded that OMB memo, not to be confused with OPM. All these, anagrams can be confusing in Washington, D.C. But the OMB memo, like you mentioned, put a temporary pause on all discretionary grants at every federal agency while the White House conducts a thorough review of the spending. And again, this is part of Donald Trump's plan to shrink the federal budget, just cut federal spending. And Russ Vought, who is expected to be confirmed as Trump's next OMB director, by the time that review concludes on February 10th, he will be in the office officially. Again, we expect it. Senate Democrats might try to slow that nomination confirmation process based on developments we've seen here regarding Israel and Gaza at the White House. But it is just another checkbox that the president is addressing in terms of hitting all of these day one, week one priorities, even though we are in week 3 technically. And it's just moving quickly. And I think the speed with which it was rolled out, like the OPM memo, is what sort of kicked off a lot of this uproar, whether it's from NGOs or Democrats, because there just was not very much information out there about how this would play out and what specific bodies would be impacted.
All right, Christian Daytok, we're going to have to leave it at that. With the Washington Examiner in the White House briefing room, Christian, can't thank you enough. Good to see you.
Thanks, Andrew. Be well.